Hello everybody, welcome to this video. In this one we're going to be taking a look at the great hammers in Dark Souls 2. Now before we get started, I want to say that the damage that I read of these weapons is going to be with a character that has 50 strength, as that seems a little bit more feasible for most players to achieve, and they will all have the Ring of Blades +2 equipped. However, the footage that you're watching is the same character with 99 strength, so that I could power stance some of these great hammers if I wanted. And finally, as I go through this list, one thing you need to keep in mind is that some of these great hammers are just copies of each other with added weight, which then means that they also have added damage, but pretty much everything else will be the exact same. An example of this is the large club and the great club. One weighs 12 units, one weighs 15. The one that weighs 15 will do more damage than the one that weighs 12, from let's say 10 strength all the way up to 99 strength. The only difference will be the weight. Also, there will be two weapons that will not be in this video. That is the Archdrake Mace and the Drakekeeper's Warpick. These weapons are classified as great hammers, but they play more like halberds. Really, the only thing that would make you think that they are great hammers is that they don't have any counter damage, which is a trend across the great hammer class. And the Archdrake Mace has 60 poise break at only 6 units, which is incredible. But these weapons effectively play as halberds. They even have the spin to win from a halberd. So yeah, let's get right into it. Starting off the list, I have put the Iron King hammer. You can get this weapon by killing the old Iron King and taking his soul to SOTFS. It weighs 24 units, 60 poise, 80 durability, and at 50 strength it will be doing 746 damage. That's with a build that had 20 intelligence and 20 faith. However, that high damage is a little bit misleading because you're not going to do that much damage when you hit the enemy, since the damage has to go through 2 barriers of resistance. This thing has a special attack that engulfs the weapon in flame, and it consumes 10 durability. Now, I put this low on the list because there's not a lot of enemies you're going to come across where this thing is going to be very useful, or more useful than other weapons on this list. The enemies that come to mind are skeletons. They are both weak to strike damage as well as fire. But besides that, I didn't find myself using this weapon. It being a boss weapon also makes it upgrade with petrified dragon bones. Taking a look at the next weapon on this list, I put the Sacred Chime hammer. You get this from killing Velstad and taking his soul to Ornifex as well. It weighs 22 units, has 70 durability, 60 poise. Like I mentioned before, all great hammers have no counter damage, and it does dark damage, this thing. With a build that has 50 strength and 20 int and 20 faith, it was doing 760 damage. The story is pretty much the same with this weapon as with the King hammer. It is just not that great to have big weapons like this that are supposed to be good against armored opponents do elemental damage. The special attack of this thing, you actually have to hold the weapon with both of your hands to get it to come out, and it takes 10 durability. And yeah, I guess you could use it to roleplay Velstad if you want to. Next up is the Malformed Shell. You get this in Aldia's Keep. There is a decrepit wall that you have to get one of the ogres to hit and break in order for you to find this weapon. It weighs 18 units, 50 durability, 60 poise, and at 50 strength it has 604 damage. Now I put this weapon this far down on the list because it kind of falls into this weird place where the weapons before it, even though they do less damage, they are significantly lighter, and the weapons that come after it in terms of weight do significantly more damage. This thing is pretty much a copy of other great hammers such as the large club or the great club, and since you get it so late, since you have to use Twinkling Titanite to upgrade it, and because it doesn't do significantly more damage than those other two, that's why I guess this spot on the list. Anyways, let's move on to the next one, which is actually a pretty interesting weapon. At least there's something unique about it. It is quite difficult to obtain. You have to go to Brightstone Cove Zeldora and get one of the pigs to follow you. I do believe it has to be one of the smaller pigs. You have to get them to follow you all the way down to the room where the spiders come down from the ceiling before you start dropping down to the webs to kill the Dukes to Freya. The pigs will start eating the grass, and then you'll find this pickaxe in the grass. It weighs 8 units, has 60 durability, 50 poise break, 150 counter damage, and then 50 strength. It will do 497 damage. Now, the moveset of this thing is very, very different than the other great hammers. It does play a little bit like a great axe, and because this thing has counter damage and it does thrust damage, you can pair it with the Leo ring. But it is a little bit different in the sense that usually great hammers are good against armor. This thing is not that good against armor because it does thrust damage. However, you will find as you're fighting enemies with this weapon that your damage will vary drastically because the sweet spot of this thing is extremely difficult to hit, but my god does it make it fun to have an 8-unit weapon do thousands of damage when you buff it and infuse it and all that kind of stuff. It doesn't get a higher spot on the list because it's extremely awkward to use and very inconsistent, but it can surprise some players in PvP. If they see this thing, they think nothing of it, and they end up taking a lot of damage to it. Anyways, let's move on to the next one. So up next, I have the Old Iron King Hammer infused with Raw. Because this weapon doesn't have any strength scaling, I have decided to infuse it with Raw. There is no downside to infusing it with Raw, aside from if you are more proficient with one of the elements and you would like to infuse it with one of the elements. Anyways, this thing is gotten by the old knights that wield it. It weighs 18 units, has 30 durability, 65 poise, 100 counter damage, and the stats to wield this thing are 30 strength and 6 dex. You don't need to go past that if this is going to be your weapon of choice. However, that might be a little difficult with the 30 durability. But basically, anywhere from 30 strength to 99, you will be doing the same damage, which is 625 when you have it infused with Raw. Nothing too special about this weapon, but what you can do is you can use these great hammers to kill lizards since they have the downwards hitting attack. And because these great hammers are pretty much copies of each other, the heavier they are, the more damage they deal. If you don't plan to upgrade them, you can just use the heaviest one that your character can feasibly wield and use them exclusively for lizards. If you use it in that way, this thing will be a slight upgrade to the large club and the great club. But yeah, not much more to say. Let's go to the next one. So up next is a pretty cool weapon. Very difficult to get. You get it from the warriors that wield it in the Iron King DLC. It weighs 35 units, has 300 durability, 60 poise. Now this thing has less poise break than the old Iron King hammer, which is weird, but okay. It does require 70 strength to wield, but you can two-hand it with, let's say, 50 strength. At 50 strength, you would be doing 697 damage. At 70 strength, you will be doing 711 damage. And at 99 strength, you will be doing 740 damage. This weapon has a little bit different of a moveset to the other ones, and you can do some cool things with it, like fly in the air. The running attack is one of my favorite attacks of this weapon. It hits twice, which is pretty surprising. It does weigh a ton. It is the heaviest weapon in the game. And yeah, overall, it's just used for a bit of fun, to be honest. You can see worth a damn when you're holding this thing with both of your hands and you're locked onto an enemy. That is worth mentioning. But even though this thing does a lot of damage, I couldn't put it higher on the list because there is actually a weapon on this list that does more damage than this. And the moveset and the attack of this thing is a little bit like slowed down compared to other weapons. So yeah, it makes it overall slightly more difficult to use. But it certainly is a lot of fun if you're up for it. So up next, I've put the Demon's Great Hammer. This weapon you can actually get quite early in the game. It upgrades with Twinkling Titanite, which can be rare, especially early on. It weighs 26 units, 70 durability, 60 poise, and at 50 strength it has 647 damage. Now there are two other weapons on this list that have 647 damage as well at 50 strength, and they weigh 20 units. So I believe maybe that because this thing is a weapon that you can potentially get very early in the game, its stats are a little bit higher and a little bit inflated. It also takes 50 strength to wield, which can be quite an investment early on. But it is one of the better weapons to wield in the beginning of the game if you can manage to get up to 25 strength and then two-hand the weapon. So yeah, it can be really good. Next up is the Malformed Skull, another weapon that I've decided to infuse with Raw because it has no scaling. You can get this from the Malformed Citizens, I believe their name is, in Aldia's Keep. Now it weighs 12 units and it only has 20 durability, 60 poise, has bleed on it, and because it doesn't have any scaling, you don't need to go past the stats to wield the weapon. At 35 strength and 7 dex, it does 648 damage, which is a lot of damage for only a 12 unit weapon. Now, the drawback of it is that it breaks very easily, but again, like I mentioned before, with stuff like lizards, or if there is a situation where you want a great hammer, you could use it exclusively for backstabs, for example, or against bosses or enemies that are extremely weak. This thing weighs the same as the large club, and at early strength levels, it will do significantly more damage. Now granted, when the large club gets the S scaling, the large club will catch up to it. So the next weapon is the Sanctum Mace. This is one of my favorite great hammers in the game. One of the reasons being is that it has a lance's running attack when you two-hand it. And it's a little bit tricky to play with this because it does poison you when you hit with it. Now the stats of the weapon, it weighs 17 units, only 30 durability, 50 poise, and at 50 strength it will be doing 597 damage. It does not have any counter damage, so you can't really combine it with the Leo Ring for those thrusting running attacks. But you can poison some enemies and some bosses with a running attack only. If you wear the right type of armor, which is the North Wanderer set, it's something you find in the DLC. You can also wear the Tattered Cloth armor and a ring that will decrease your poison buildup. This thing can be pretty useful to poison bosses with. And it being a strike weapon, you kind of get 2-for-1. Strike is one of the best damage types in this game. So if you use this exclusively for bosses and you want to be a bit of a glass cannon wearing the Tattered Cloth armor and the ring just to poison bosses such as Smelter Demon, yeah, it can be pretty fun. In PvP, it's also very fun. Players do not expect it. You can buff it with a Poison Pine resin to poison things even quicker. And yeah, overall, it's just a lot of fun. Next up, I have the Gurm Great Hammer. As I was making my way through this game in the higher NG pluses, getting all the upgrades, I did tend to use this thing quite a bit because it has a ton of damage. There is one weapon that is better than it, but it's very difficult to get. So I ended up going to this one. Plus, I absolutely find the moveset hilarious, even though it's awkward and very difficult to use. So reading through the stats, it weighs 20 units, 80 durability, 60 poise, and at 50 strength, it does 647 damage. You get this from the Gurm soldiers in the Doors of Pharaohs. And yeah, like unfortunately it doesn't have a lot of reach. So that's something you have to keep in mind. But when I was playing through the game on high NG pluses, I didn't really care about much more than just doing a lot of damage. And when I found myself in a situation where I would normally use a Great Hammer, I tended to go to this one because it did one of the highest damage, except for things like the Giant Warrior Club and the Chicken Wing. But the Giant Warrior Club weighs a lot, and the Chicken Wing weighs even more, and it's also very difficult to get. So this thing was the most feasible, high damaging weapon that I could use in most scenarios before I got like every weapon in the game. Alright, so I'm gonna move on to the next one because it's very similar to the Gurm Great Hammer, but in my opinion it's just better in every way. Let's just read through the stats. It is also 20 weight, 90 durability, 60 poise, and at 50 strength, it does 647 damage. So those stats are pretty much identical, except the fact that it has a better moveset and it actually has better durability. Now, the drawback of this weapon is that it is extremely difficult to get. There is only one Drakekeeper, if I'm not mistaken, that actually wields this thing, and there is an Invader as well. But I don't even know if he can drop it. I've never gotten it from him. So this thing has the moveset that I would consider to be the staple moveset of Great Hammers, that being the Large Club and the Great Club's moveset. So it is easier to use than the Gurm Great Hammer, and it does the same damage and all that. But it doesn't have as much character for sure as the Gurm Great Hammer. That thing is hilarious. Anyways, like I mentioned, you get it from a Drakekeeper in the Dragon Shrine. It upgrades with a regular Titanite, which is good. But prepare to farm this thing for a very, very long time unless you get really lucky. Up next, I have the Great Club. This is found in a wooden chest as you're making your way down through the gutter. It weighs 15 units, 70 durability, 60 poise, and at 50 strength, you will be doing 617 damage with a Ring of Blades +2. Now, this is one of those hammers that fall into that category of being very, very similar or pretty much identical to other hammers, except the difference is the weight. However, you can get this thing quite early on. You can use a bonfire ascetic if you want to power stance it, or if you want to save yourself a bonfire ascetic, you can power stance it with the Large Club. That is the next weapon on this list, which acts and behaves pretty much identical to this thing. So let's talk about that one at the same time. This thing is gotten in the Lost Bastille, another level that you can access very early in the beginning. It weighs 12 units, has 70 durability, 60 poise, and at 50 strength, it has 596 damage. So the Great Club is heavier, and therefore it does more damage. Really, the only reason that I put the Large Club before the Great Club is because I've been mentioning that you can use these things for killing lizards. Even unupgraded, both of these weapons should be able to one-shot most of the lizards in the beginning of the game, or at the very most two-shot, because when you two-hand the Great Hammers, you do a downwards attack and then you can follow that up with a strong attack to downwards hit again, and there's not going to be any lizards that survives that even when these weapons are not upgraded. So what you could do is that you could use the lightest of these weapons if you're using them as a two-handed weapon and just kill lizards that way. Another thing that's pretty nice about these, and the reason that I mentioned that I don't necessarily always upgrade these, is because in one of the DLCs you can get a large club +8, which means that you can save yourself a lot of materials not having to upgrade some of these weapons. Because they're quite similar, I tend to use that large club +8 when I get it, and then only spend minimal amounts of upgrade materials to finish it off. The DLCs are quite nice. They do have a couple of upgraded weapons, but this one I do find to be one of the more useful weapons that you actually get in the DLC. Anyways, this one is also one of my favorites because it is very thin compared to some of the other great hammers, and although I don't fight a lot locked on, sometimes the size of the great hammers can get in your way. This is especially the case when you are fighting locked onto enemies. So because this thing is the thinnest, it doesn't obstruct your view quite as much. Now let's move on to number 2. At number 2, I've decided to put the Dragon Tooth. This thing can be gotten in the Lost Bastille as well as the Dragon Eyrie. It upgrades with Twinkling Titanite. It weighs 20 units, 70 durability, 60 poise, and at 50 strength you will be doing 644 damage. Now this thing has a little bit of a different moveset than the typical, what I would call the typical hammer moveset. I actually prefer this weapon's moveset. Now only when you two-hand it does it have a different moveset, but I do prefer this thing because it hits side to side in a way that is a little bit easier to handle. But yeah, it's not extremely different to the other ones. Now the last 4 weapons that I've talked about pretty much have that thing where they do more damage based on their weight, right? This thing distinguishes itself that it has a slightly different moveset, and although the Drakekeeper's Warhammer weighs the same and it does more damage, I do prefer the moveset of the Dragon Tooth, as well as the fact that even though yes, it upgrades with Twinkling Titanite, this is not exactly a bad weapon to commit and upgrade with Twinkling Titanite if you want to do that. It's one of the better Twinkling Titanite weapons. Also, the Drakekeeper's Warhammer is very, very difficult to get, and the Gurm Great Hammer, like I mentioned before, is fun for the memes, but it's not very, very effective if you're trying to be extremely serious. Now, a competitor to the Dragon Tooth early on, as far as like great hammers, is actually the Demon's Great Hammer, if you happen to get that one. They both upgrade with Twinkling Titanite. However, because later on in the game you can find the Drakekeeper's Hammer and the Gurm Great Hammer and other hammers, I don't recommend using your Twinkling Titanite to upgrade the Demon's Great Hammer. Instead, do the Dragon Tooth or save them. Because what I like to do when upgrading boss weapons or Twinkling Titanite weapons is that I like to see what are other weapons in its category that require the same upgrade material and that play very similar, that you would use in a very similar way. And I just prefer the Dragon Tooth over the Demon's Great Hammer. Not to mention that early on in the game, if you want to do a lot of strike damage, you can use the Mace or the Craftsman's Hammer, and they are significantly lighter than these two weapons. Now, at number 1, I have put the Giant Warrior Club. This thing is gotten in one of the Giant Memories. The stats of this weapon: it weighs 30 units, 50 durability, 60 poise, and at 50 strength, you will do 717 damage. Now, I'm pretty sure this thing has the highest attack rating of any weapon in the game. At 99 strength though, it has 760 damage, which is more than the Smelter Hammer. The Giant Warrior Club has a little bit of a different moveset than the typical one, that I would consider the typical one at least for the Great Hammers. Instead of starting off with the Smash, it starts off with the Spin Attack and then finishes off with a Smash. That is a little bit worse in my opinion, but regardless of that, this weapon is fantastic for doing damage. Backstabs and guard breaks will kill most things in the game in one hit. And yeah, I just simply couldn't ignore the damage of this weapon. With 30 strength, you can two-hand it as well. And now that we have finished with the list, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Great Hammers in general, because there is a thing that you can do with Great Hammers, the elephant in the room, if you will. You can, if you want to cheese this game, just do the R2 attack on pretty much everything and just flatten most enemies in the game. I have actually gotten surprised at how many big enemies you can flatten with the R2 attack of these Great Hammers. It does make certain parts of the game extremely trivial. This is one of the reasons, for example, I think that these Great Hammers don't have any counter damage, because Ultra Great Swords do comparable damage to Great Hammers, but they have on average 130 counter damage. However, you can't do these things with Ultra Great Sword. Flattening enemies is extremely powerful, because even after you flatten an enemy, I think you have time to take an Estus Flask before they get up. It acts kind of like a stunning effect. It pauses the fight, if you will. So yeah, that is very, very powerful. It is the strongest attack of the hammer, so it consumes a significant amount of stamina. But because you can get the large club and the great club quite early on, if you want to smash things, you could potentially just do that for a very long time into the game. Now, I highly recommend having some of these hammers in your inventory. Because they are great weapons like this, they can do certain things that other weapons cannot, such as blow up barrels easily, or flatten enemies, or kill lizards, or poise break certain enemies. They're also very good for backstabs and ripostes, so if you're having an enemy that turtles a lot, you can try to parry or backstab them. When I play the DLC, for example, I tend to lean towards heavier hitting weapons, because you can stagger the enemies. The enemies in the DLC tend to have a lot of poise, so you could use big weapons to stagger them, and backstab is actually one of the best ways to make your way through the DLC. Now, these things can allow you to flatten the enemies as well, which gives you that advantage. Yeah, I think the Great Hammers are probably one of the best, if not the best weapon class to use in the DLC. It depends a little bit on the situation. They're not the greatest for crowd control. However, you could use something like the Dragon Tooth for crowd control because its attack at least are somewhat side to side, you know, and you have the option to flatten and you have the option to backstab. Not to mention that their durability is quite high as well. Yeah, Great Hammer is a fantastic class of weapons. I think they are very well balanced with their pros and cons. Being high damaging but not having counterattack. They are strong but also cumbersome, and you have to think about the way you use them. You can't just spam them out. So yeah, that is it though for the video. Thank you for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.